we have received almost 400 registrations since we started uh, invitations coming in. Okay, so without much further ado, we will now start our program with a prayer. Sorry about that.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Rahmanirrahim. Malik Yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alaihim. Ghairil maghdubi alaihim waladhdallin. Amin.
Ama namin sumasalangit ka. Sinasamba namin ang ngalan mo. Ikaw ang dahilan kung bakit kami ay lumalaban. Hinahangad namin ang kapayapaan ng lahat. Ang pagkakaisa ng bawat tao. Tulong-tulong sa bawat laban. Gabayan niyo ang aming kinikilos. Kami patawarin mo sa mga salang ginawa ng sangkatauhan. Hinihingi ang iyong pagmamahal at karunungan. O Diyos Jesucristo na makapangyarihan, Espiritu Santo. Amen.
Lumalaban sa problema.
Okay, let's have the pambansang awit.
Bayang magiliw, kailas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa bibig mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisihin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit bumabaw, may dilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang isap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagninigin, ang bituin at araw ng kailan pag may magdidilim, lupa ng araw ng walwali pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Sorry, I got disconnected earlier. Good morning once again. We will first listen to the welcome remarks from the university president because this forum is spearheaded by the Ugnayang Pang-Agham Tao, UGAT, the Anthropological Association of the Philippines, in coordination with the
Pag audio, hindi ako nasasama, no? Yun, nakukuha.
So, let's have the welcome remarks first before we have the opening remarks from the UGAT president. Wala, kadalik lang ha. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Sometimes we encounter things like this. Wait.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. The University of San Carlos, through the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History, or DASH, and through the Center of Social Research and Education, or CSsR, is privileged to co-host with Ugnayang Agham Tao, or UGAT, this roundtable discussion on Lumad, what is in it both as a term and as the identity of people. The plight of our brothers and sisters in the indigenous communities,
Sorry again for
hiring
the technical difficulty with
and tragic.
hi. Wait lang yun. Sorry about that. Okay, here it is.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. The University of San Carlos, through the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History, or DASH, and through the Center of Social Research and Education, or CSsR, is privileged to co-host with Ugnayang Agham Tao, or UGAT, this roundtable discussion on Lumad, what is in it both as a term and as the identity of people. The plight of our brothers and sisters in the indigenous communities, particularly the Lumad, has been in the news for a number of weeks already. Their situations and stories can be both inspiring and tragic, enlightening and disheartening. Lately, even the term Lumad has invited scrutiny and given a new meaning. It is a bit strange that the reinterpretation of this name is placed in a new context which the Lumad themselves did not create or cause to exist. But this should not be surprising. Does not rest on the words themselves, but on the manner they are said and the context within which they are said. Austrian-British philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein alluded to this view of language as a social practice and thus a construct of society. But we also need to understand that in society, there are power dynamics which can alter the context and change the way words are construed. When this happens, language or word acquires initiation, which can be problematic and questionable. Focusing on the word Lumad and the people it represents, this roundtable discussion could give us opportunities to reflect on the importance of semantics and their implication in our communities, societies, relationships, and even on our own integrity. With this note, I welcome you all to this roundtable discussion. Thank you and God bless.
Okay, thank you very much, Father Narciso Silian, University President of the University of San Carlos. So let me now turn you over to the President of the Ugnayang Pag-agham Tao, UGAT, to give the opening remarks and the rationale behind this roundtable discussion. Let us all welcome Skilte Labastilla, President of UGAT.
Hello, maayong buntag sa atong tanan. Magandang araw sa lahat. My apologies if the remarks I prepared is in the Filipino language. Ang ugnayang pang-agham tao o UGAT ay nabuo noong 1977 at simula noon ay kaagapay na ng aming organisasyon na binubuo ng mga akademiko, mananaliksik at mag-aaral ng antropolohiya ang mga marginalisadong grupo sa ating lipunan. Kasama na ang mga katutubong Pilipino. Sa katunayan, nung binalikan ko ang pinakaunang records ng UGAT, 1977, isa sa mga nakasulat na layunin ng mga nagtatag ng aming grupo ay to promote and deepen the knowledge, understanding, and participation among different ethno-linguistic groups working towards an integrated national consciousness and development. Ang anthropology po ay isang agham panlipunan, social science. Ibig sabihin ay sistematiko ang pangangalap ng datos at mabusising inaanalisa ang mga ito at dumadaan sa ilang review ng mga dalubhasa bago pa man maibahagi ang mga kaalaman sa publiko. Nitong March 2, naglabas ng memorandum ang National Commission on Indigenous Peoples na bumabatikos sa paggamit sa salitang lumad. At inanunsyo nila ito kasama ng NTF-LCAC sa isang online discussion at may naimbitahan silang isang tribal leader na nagsabi na ang salitang lumad di umano ay napagkasundo ang gamitin sa isang komperensya sa UGAT noong 1987. Kaya po, mahalaga sa amin ang pagkakataong ito na mabigyang tugon at linaw ang mga pahayag na ito sa pamamagitan nitong ating roundtable discussion ngayong umaga at sa darating na Sabado. Mahalaga po na maunawaan ng lahat na hindi maaring basta-basta na lang ipagsasawalang bahala ang napakarami ng mga pag-aaral tungkol sa lumad at kung paano sinimulang gamitin ang salita, na kung tutuusin ay hango sa Cebuano na ang katumbas sa Tagalog ay katutubo at sa salitang Ingles ay indigenous. Kung wala po tayong problema sa salitang katutubo at sa katagang Indigenous Peoples o IP, nararapat nga ba nating problemahin ang salitang lumad? Kung okay lang na Tagalog at English ang gamitin, bakit hindi pwede ang Bisaya? Pupwede din ba na ang isang tao halimbawa ay isang Agusanon, Manobo, Lumad at Pilipino ng sabay-sabay? Kaya nagagalak ako ngayon na maanyayahan ng 4 na dalubhasang antropologo at mananaliksik na nag-google ng maraming taon sa pag-aaral at pakikipamuhay kasama ang mga katutubo sa Mindanao para makapagbigay ng linaw at liwanag sa usaping ito. Sa ikalawang bahagi naman sa Sabado ay mapapakinggan natin ang mga lider ng etnolinguistikong grupo sa Mindanao katulad ng Manobo, Teduray at Talaandi upang malaman ang kanilang pananaw. Ang layunin po sana nating lahat ay makinig sa mas nakakarami, hindi sa iisa lang, at ang magkakaunawaan imbes na magkakatunggalian. Kaya po, binigyan natin ng imbitasyon ang NCIP at iba pang mga ahensya ng pamahalaan na makakatulong sa pagpapatuloy sa paglinaw sa usaping ito. At sana po ay nandito sila ngayong umaga. Maraming salamat po.
Okay, thank you very much, Skilty. I will now turn over the moderation of this roundtable discussion to this morning's moderator, Lilian de la Peña. Lilian. Lilian, are you there?
So, bakit baliktad?
Ewan ko.
Sandali lang.
Settings ng camera siguro.
Sandali lang. Ulma? Setting ng camera ko, baliktad ako. Baliktad. Sige na.
Okay, so for this morning, we have 3 presenters. While waiting for the moderator, let me just introduce our 3 presenters. We have here Dr. Gatmaytan, then Dr.
Zona, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, Zona, okay.
Okay na, Lilian.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go back to Lilian de la Peña for the moderation of today's roundtable discussion.
Okay, maraming salamat, Zona. Maraming salamat, Skilty. And maayong buntag sa tanan, coming from Cagayan de Oro City in Mindanao. And I am Lilian de la Peña, the one moderating this first roundtable of UGAT. May mga participants tayo coming from different time zones. So I say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. No? So Ito ang unang roundtable discussion ng UGAT na ang pamagat ay What's in a Name? Views from Anthropologists on Lumad. Ang pangalawang roundtable na gagawin ng UGAT dito ay gaganapin sa Sabado, no, this coming Saturday, March 27, and ang co-host ng UGAT ay ang Ateneo de Davao University sa Davao City. Now, for this first roundtable discussion, we have 3 discussants and 1 reactor. But first, for our discussants, we have Dr. Augusto B. Gatmaytan. Si Dr. Gatmaytan ay isang professor and director of Ateneo Institute of Anthropology, Ateneo de Davao University. Si Dr. Gatmaytan ay babad sa research with the Manobo and Banwaong communities sa Agusan del Sur province sa Mindanao. Ang pangalawa nating discussant ay si Dr. Oona Paredes. Si Dr. Paredes ay isang assistant professor galing sa University of California, Los Angeles, although tubong Mindanao at taga Mindanao si Dr. Oona Paredes. Si Dr. Paredes ay gumagawa ng research sa mga sibukunon ng Northern Mindanao. Ang pangatlo nating discussant ay si Dr. Cherubim Quizon, isang associate professor of anthropology coming from Seton Hall University. Ang principal research ni Dr. Cherubim ay sa mga bagobo ng Mindanao on textile and dress. So, ito yung tatlo nating discussants sa ngayon. And merong reaction and may open forum tayo pagkatapos. So, Dr. Augusto Gatmaytan, I'll hand over the work to you now.
Maayong buntag sa tanan. I'm speaking here from my home in Davao. Thank you for organizing this forum and for giving me this opportunity to share my views. In the interest of time, I'd like to simply read my prepared statement for this morning. I understand there's going to be a discussion later, so any points that I do not address at this point, we can discuss later. This roundtable discussion was prompted by the NCIP's resolution number 09009-2021 of this year, denouncing the use of the term Lumad to refer to the indigenous peoples of Mindanao. Please allow me to focus on this resolution. The resolution claims that the indigenous leaders are clamoring for an end to the use of the name Lumad to refer to the indigenous peoples of Mindanao. If there is such a clamor, however, it seems to be a very quiet one. I have been working with indigenous communities across Mindanao since the 1980s, and I have yet to encounter anyone who actively campaigns against the use of the name Lumad. Certainly, there have been people, and there are people who dislike the term, do not use it, or cannot relate to it, but this hardly amounts to a clamor. What evidence is there of this clamor? Everyone was getting on with their lives until the NCIP invented this crisis. Why is the NCIP trying to project the existence of such a clamor? The resolution states that the emergence of the name Lumad is marred by its association with the CPP, NPA, and NDF. As the ECIP, or Episcopal Commission of Indigenous Peoples, has recently pointed out, however, the emergence of the term is linked to the pioneering pastoral work of the Catholic Church in Mindanao and Sulu in the 1970s, which developed without an ideological agenda, even as it supported indigenous peoples or communities suffering at the hands of a repressive state and exploitative business interests. It thus seems that rather than the CPP, NPA, NDF coining or appropriating the term, they were only following the lead of the church and its indigenous community partners by riding on their growing or continuing use of the name. But even if the CPP, NPA, NDF did use the name in their organizing or fundraising work, what of it? We similarly stop using the words Islam or Islamic because it has been marred by its association with the Maute group and the extremist interpretation of Islam championed by ISIS. The resolution decries how the name Lumad is not an indigenous term. However, there is no pan-Mindanao indigenous term for the Aboriginal peoples of the island, taken as a group. The resolution does offer alternative terminology, but these are all in English or Filipino. Lumad may be a Visayan term, but at least it does not recall our colonial subjugation or reiterate the political and cultural dominance of Imperial Manila. More importantly, it was the indigenous communities of Mindanao themselves who gradually adopted or appropriated the name Lumad as a way of asserting a shared identity or location. They have, in other words, made it their own, much like the Moro peoples have made the term Moro their own. The resolution argues that that the word Lumad should not be used because the LMPF leaders who allegedly adopted the term are not the recognized representatives of the indigenous peoples of Mindanao. First, it is not clear at all if it was the LMPF that first adopted the name Lumad. Given the information brought to light by Karl of Mindanews, that name has been in use since the late 1970s and thus makes the resolution's claim highly debatable. Other groups or individuals might have previously adopted the name already, but had neglected to document the occasion. Second, this argument betrays its proponents' lack of historical awareness. In the 1990s, there was no island-wide mechanism for selecting recognized representatives of all indigenous peoples of Mindanao. On the one hand, the indigenous groups of Mindanao have historically been uncentralized acephalous polities organized into largely autonomous villages or settlements. On the other hand, there were in the 80s and 90s only separate, relatively small networks of communities and leaders linked together by churches or by NGOs or by indigenous peoples organizing initiatives or by local politicians or by Panamin and the OSCC. What seems to have happened is that indigenous leaders, advocates, or organizations on their own or taking their cue from church workers, NGOs, or yes, even ideologues, began to refer to themselves as Lumad. This appropriation of the Visayan word Lumad represents the historical moment when indigenous communities across Mindanao, who until that point had been relatively isolated from each other, realized that they shared history, displacement, violence, and discrimination, faced a common set of problems, and similarly aspired for recognition and development. These shared characteristics provided the basis for a collective identity, an identity that they have over time chosen to refer to as Lumad. As members of marginalized groups, these pioneering leaders and advocates could not force other groups, peoples, or communities to do the same. But over the succeeding 40 years, other indigenous organizations and communities of varying political persuasions all across Mindanao have similarly adopted or used the name Lumad. This suggests that with their growing link to the political, economic, and cultural mainstream, communities and organizations across the island have also begun to think of themselves not as isolated communities, but as part of the indigenous peoples of Mindanao taken as a group. This is not to say that they have abandoned their own names for their own peoples. The politics and processes of identity formation allow people, for example, to be, number one, an individual. Number two, a member of a family as designated by a surname or family name. Number three, a member of, for example, the Arumanan Manubo of Carmen, North Cotabato. Number four, a member of the Cotabato Manubo group along with the Ilianen and the Kirintiken, but not the Umayamnon and Adgawanon. Number five, a Lumad, along with the Subanen and the Mandaya, but not the Kalinga or the Buhid. Number six, a member of the indigenous population of the Philippines. And finally, a Filipino. This provides members of indigenous groups different ways of referring to oneself or to one's group in different contexts and or for different purposes. These varying ways of describing oneself do not contradict each other. One does not surrender one's identity as Higaunon or Blaan by using the name Lumad, any more than being a proud Cebuano makes one less Filipino. No one except perhaps for the NCIP, is confused by any of this. In the field, it is the indigenous community's own names for themselves that are employed in local settings and local discourses. The term Lumad is deployed only as a sort of conversational alternative for the local names, or when referencing the indigenous peoples of Mindanao as a group. For example, to compare the situation of indigenous peoples in Mindanao with those of Palawan. In other words, it is a collective name to refer to the indigenous peoples of Mindanao in the way that Igorot or Kaigorotan or Moro and Bangsamoro are collective terms for groups of peoples who share certain historical, political, and cultural characteristics. What is more, people in the communities do not narrowly associate the term Lumad with the left. Indigenous groups, organizations, and leaders of different political persuasions use the name to refer to the Aboriginal peoples of Mindanao. So people speak of Lumad Kafgu, no? Or Lumad members of the Kafgu, or Lumad members of the NPA, or of Lumad who are neither. No? The resolution finally asserts that there are no ancestral domains or territories under the name of Lumad, implying that there is no such thing as a Lumad. It is true that there are no territories under the name of Lumad, but this proves nothing. The name Lumad is not intended to replace the various endonyms of indigenous peoples in Mindanao, nor is it used that way. Members of indigenous peoples or communities know, for example, that they are Tiboli, and that their domains and territories belong to them as members of the Tipoli people, not as Lumad. It is not surprising then that they claim their ancestral domains as Tiboli. Having said that, there are still circumstances when they might find the name Lumad useful. The NCIP resolution, therefore, fails to justify its call for ending the use of the name Lumad. What the NCIP resolution does achieve is to reflect this moment in our political history, when we witness the dawn of an Orwellian dystopia where the state seeks to control how people think by controlling how people use language. It seeks to persuade people that using the name Lumad is somehow to be associated with the CPP, NPA, and NDF. In doing this, the NCIP has arrogated unto itself the power to determine who the indigenous peoples are and how they are to be called. But this right belongs not to the NCIP, not to the state, but to the indigenous peoples themselves. The indigenous peoples have the right to self-ascription, which is itself rooted in their fundamental right to self-determination. They have the right to determine, among other things, their own name or names. There are examples of groups choosing how they are to be called. One well-known example is that of the Ilongot of Nueva Vizcaya, who sometime in the 1980s began to call themselves Bugkalot. Here in Mindanao, the Bukidnon of Songko in Bukidnon province now call themselves Talaandig. And some of the Manobo communities in the Davao-Bukidnon boundary now call themselves Matig Salug. These choices have all been respected. Why should the case of the Lumad be so different? If indigenous organizations or communities wish to call themselves Lumad in reference to their being part of the indigenous population of Mindanao, that is their right. The NCIP should respect their will and refrain from agitating or terrorizing others from using it. Thank you.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Gus. Dr. Gatmaytan, maraming salamat.
Thank you.
Yung pangalawa nating discussant, now we will proceed to our second discussant, Dr. Oona Paredes. Are you ready?
Yes. If you
Thank
can
you.
hear me. Si Una naging pangalawa. So, thanks Gus for that really thorough statement. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things that I think I won't say anymore. And so my statement will be very short because you've covered pretty much everything. So I'm just gonna say a very short statement. Uh, those of you who are familiar with my work already know that I use the term Lumad very actively in my presentations and publications. It was a commonly used term by the time I started my academic career. So I've been using it for a very long time. And in fact, for my ethno-historical book, A Mountain of Difference, I subtitled it The Lumad in Early Colonial Mindanao. In this case, I made a conscious decision to apply the term Lumad retroactively as a way to talk about the indigenous peoples of Mindanao in a collective way, without concern for individual ethnic groups. Part of the justification for this is the fact that the current ethnic groupings, as we know them, cannot necessarily be projected back to time immemorial, because we know from understanding historical processes that took place in the Philippines that the cultural diversity we see in the Philippines today, including the division of people into our present day ethnic groups, was influenced very strongly, or perhaps even created by the process that William Henry Scott called colonial alchemy. Moreover, the group names themselves can be misleading. We know that in Southeast Asia, both ethnic identity and naming can be quite fluid, and that the names some populations had in the past do not necessarily correspond to the ethnic group names we have in the present, even if they're identical names. So the term Lumad was and is a simple shortcut way to refer in a general way to this specific category of people, the non-Muslim indigenous peoples of Mindanao, as well as to their ancestors. Of course, all the IPs or Katutubo of the Philippines have many comparable experiences, and they share many of the same kinds of struggles. They also share many significant commonalities with IPs all over the world. But those of us who work with and care about the Lumad IPs know that there are also specific historical, political, and cultural commonalities that they share that are unique to the Mindanao context. I know that for the same reason, it's also useful for the Lumads themselves to be able to communicate, cooperate, collaborate, and otherwise bond with each other as they share a common plight. And the name Lumad, the word Lumad, the term Lumad, lends itself to this collaboration. For this reason, I think it's quite important to have a way to talk about Mindanao IPs as a collective. And Lumads, like it or not, uh, the term Lumad has been a collective term for many decades now. Um, so this is my academic response to the current statement by NCIP. But as a Lumad ally and as a Mindanaoan myself, I have more profound concerns about a statement that strongly implies curtailing freedom of speech as well as freedom of thought, not just for outsiders like academics, NGO workers, and others, but of Lumads themselves as well. I've had some talks with several people in Mindanao IPs to hear their thoughts on this issue. The universal response has been that they don't mind the term lumad at all and don't understand ngano agas na lang nagka-problema karon sa term nga nga lumad nga dugay naman ni kaayo nga term. Okay? That's exactly what they said. Dugay na ni kaayo. Karon pa lang nag-react. So in other words, they don't have a deep attachment to the term, but they also don't think that the government response to eliminate the term altogether is warranted at all in any way. And I should point out that many of the people I work with among the Lumad have no love for the NPA, the NDF, the left, or anyone they perceive as leftist. And in fact, some of them will never forgive me for talking them into voting for Risa Ontiveros in 2016. Most of them have been, in fact, enthusiastic supporters of the current president who regularly post stuff on Facebook against his critics. So, these are not the kind of people who you'd think would object to a government statement like this. Other IPs I know who are less enamored of the president are more sanguine about the realities they're facing in this situation. In terms of those who have the burden of leadership roles in their communities or across different communities, they fear that this will make them vulnerable to being red tagged just for being community leaders, given that a lot of what they do involves making sure that their people's voices are heard and that their needs are addressed. And they are aware of how easily their actions might be politicized by others, especially when it comes to politicizing a very simple basic term like lumad. And not just by the government, okay? So they fear that they'll be politicized when voicing a community issue that can very easily sound like a protest or critique, especially if it comes from those in the margins of society, those who, like the IPs, are normally looked down upon by others and treated in a patronizing way. To be an IP in our society is to be forced to advocate for yourself and your community on a daily basis for the most basic things. And it should not be interpreted as political activism when it is really just basic survival and the exercise of one's basic rights as a citizen. I want to be clear that when I say that they are being treated patronizingly by others, I don't mean just the government, but anyone who presumes that the IPs are not conscious enough or educated enough or sensible enough to have their own voice and make their own decisions. I mean anyone who presumes to speak for IPs and impose their own agendas and ideologies on them and somehow expect total compliance. I want to be clear that I'm critical of anyone who does not listen to what IPs have to say or respect their right to self-determination. It doesn't matter if you're right-wing or left-wing. The only agenda I support here is whatever agenda each IP community might be. I think there are too many of us, including those of us in the academe, who believe that we know what's best for the Lumads or other IPs. We all need to do better. Thank you. That's my statement.
Maraming salamat, Una. Hi. So yung pangatlo nating discussant ay si Dr. Cherubim. Dr. Cherry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I
Thank
hope
you.
you can hear me.
Yes, you're clear.
So maraming salamat kay Una at kay Gas for wonderful remarks. What my responses will be partly written out and partly also bulleted out. Pero hello po sa inyong lahat. Nandito po ako sa Brooklyn, New York. Gabi po dito. Ang trabaho ko, my work has been with Tagabao Bagobo ng Davao del Sur, Davao City. But I have been working in many other parts of Mindanao dahil ang research ko po ay textiles, specifically Abaca, Ikat textiles. And so I think compared to Gus and to Una, medyo iba yung pasok ko, no? My entry into the research is a little bit different. And also the time zone of my research when I did my field research was essentially bago na implement ang IPRA. Okay, so so I'm going to just read my some of my remarks here, and but I do want to say that I am very grateful for Gus's rebuttal of the NCIP memorandum statement, and also I echo very much Una's cautionary at the very end of her statement na wag nating kalimutan na even us anthropologists, no, are likely to be guilty, right, of the error, the grave error, right, of trying to speak, no, for other people's, right, and make certain assumptions about ano yung pananaw nila at ano yung kanilang mga gustong sabihin. So let me just begin by reading what I have so far and then proceed from there. So first, I thank UGAT, no, for inviting me to this forum. Even though this is one of the upshots of COVID, no, I have never been able to attend a single UGAT conference, even though I am one of that rare breed called a lifetime member, because the UGAT conferences happen in October, which is right smack in the middle of the fall term in the United States where I teach. So it's a very rare and welcome moment for me to be able to listen to my co-panelists and also look forward to the comments of our brother Karl after this. The way I've framed my thoughts is to actually respond to the 3 guide questions that we were given, and I'm very grateful for these guide questions. I would like to preface my remarks, though, by stating that among today's panelists, I may be the one who has used the term no, Lumad the least, using it in a single article where I unpack and delineate the ways it has been used, and invite a conscious usage of the term as one that relies on erasure, which I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit. No? So ang unang tanong po na binigay sa amin sa panel is, what is your view about the NCIP denouncement of Lumad? So I thank Maria Mangahas, who is the editor of Aghamtao of UGAT, who shared the context of the issue with the timeline of the Facebook post, right? In February, with a subsequent Rappler report, the virtual press con in early March, where I listened and annotated to Datilito Omos's narrative, right, with great interest. But to respond to this question, I'd like to take a long, kind of more historical view as well as a structural view on the NCIP denouncement of the use of the term. The immediate issue, of course, would be the tight association of the term that the resolution is trying to do, right, with the CPP, NPA, NDF. as articulated in the resolution. No? Though I do not seek to minimize the urgency and complexity of that specific issue, which is really what's the forefront of our consciousness right now, especially in the light of its immediate existential impact on anthropologists as a profession, perhaps shared with lawyers and judges and such, no, in the climate of Philippine politics, no, I suggest that it's actually part of a larger structural inevitability of which the state as an institution has the most say in the lives of Indigenous peoples. So if we think of the NCIP as created by the Republic Act 8731 in 1997, we need to also think about it vis-a-vis another government agency called the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, right, which is created by the Republic Act 7356, right, in 1992. And meantime, there's yet another government institution that deals with Indigenous peoples, right, which is the National Museum. And if I try to figure out when was that created, it's a colonial institution from 1901, which changed each time, right? We have these various constitutions. So it's a very complex issue even now. No? And then at the time of my fieldwork in the late 90s, the most important institution that the Indigenous peoples were dealing with was in Mindanao was the OSCC, the Office of Southern Cultural Communities. And in the North would be the Office of Northern Cultural Communities. Before that, in my childhood, it would have been Panamin, right? Prior to that, in my parents' generation, the Commission on National Integration, right? So we have this kind of interesting situation wherein where we are right now is actually linked back to the reality that you have the NCIP essentially having a structural kind of dispute, no, with other agencies of the government that deal with the IPs. So this is very important for us to keep in mind. I'm not here to say that we should advocate one or the other. It's to point this out, that these are the results of our laws, right? But we have to remember that the law is a movable wall that reflects the society that it serves. Hence, these types of discussions, I believe, are very welcome, no? Because it will allow us to reflect, right, on how laws serve or fail to serve, right? Our society, right? And as well as in this case, the Indigenous peoples that, you know, that the nation claims, right, hopes to serve. So that's my response for the first question. The second question that we were given is, how did anthropology inform and shape the Lumad discourse? So for this, I figured that my response would basically be in three parts, right? Anthropology shapes this discourse and will continue to shape this discourse, as we've heard from some of the remarks, right, of Gus and Oona, because ethnography is the central kind of tool, right, of anthropology. And the central spirit of ethnography is that we as anthropologists, we describe, we do not prescribe. So this whole issue of they denounce the use of this term and we should condemn it and stop people from using it is quite ridiculous, no? Because no one has ever been able to successfully, I guess, unless you think about libel suits, no? But I mean, you know, to be able to funnel, right, the speech of people, right, has been attempted many, many times for the entire length of human history, right? But as anthropologists, right, we can describe the usage of terms, even terms that we might not agree with, right? So we describe, hence, in my field work, for example, in my particular field work, right, Lumad was not an important word. It did not come up, right? And that was because of the specific type of research that I was doing, right? And in Oona's research, right, it came up quite a bit because of the specific type of research she was doing, as well as also the time frame of when our specific ethnographic kind of, right, time in the field was taking place. The second way by which I think anthropology shaped the Lumad discourse kind of goes back to our, right, this notion of constitutions, right? In 1987, our constitution, right, had actually the contribution of an anthropologist, right? CSsR Pons Benagen, right, was part of the Constitutional Convention, right? And so that actually helped shape, right, the reality of the IPRA law, right? As well as all the other initiatives, right, that we as a country, right, claim is important to us. The third way by which anthropology shapes the Lumad discourse, and this one I'd like to really point out to people, and perhaps it's clear to me because I teach, right, Indigenous peoples to students that are not Filipino, right? So out of a class of 30, I have 2 maybe who are Filipino American. So the teaching that I have been doing for Indigenous peoples have always been geared essentially to folks who are more kind of immersed, right, in native North America, right? And so the whole discussion of Lumad as a term inevitably links to discussions of Native Americans or First Peoples, which are the legal terms, right, in the US and Canada. But here in the US, kahit na Native Americans is supposed to be the legal term, there is, of course, the American Indian movement, right, which deliberately uses American Indian as a term, as a self-referential term, kind of the way our heroes of the revolution, right, took that term, the pejorative term Indio, and made it Los Indios Bravos, right? So you kind of like have these inversions, right? You take this term and you invert it and you change it, right? Which is part of the beauty of what we as anthropologists describe, right? This kind of the changing of meanings of the terms. The third way, the other way by which this global linkage, right, of Lumad as a term needs to also be thought about by us is that, you know, essentially we're dealing here with the notion of, right, a term that might be governed by law, right, by a constitutional kind of category. When this issue came up, I was fortunate enough to be in a Zoom meeting. You know, Zoom is wonderful in the way that we can talk to all kinds of people. In the Zoom meeting, actually with Arjun Apadura, and I was very, very distressed about what was happening with this Lumad issue and the red tagging. And I asked him, you know, what's the experience that you have in India, right? And he mentioned to me, right, you know, in India, there is this constitutional category of OBCs, right? Which, I kid you not, OBC means other backward classes. So that's the term that they have in their constitution of 1950. A very unfortunate term, but that is the term that is used, right, to refer to a specific set of economically and socially disadvantaged peoples that then the government seeks to uplift, right? But the term stays. So we have this really kind of complexness, right, within ways by which society seeks to address it. And the role of anthropologists in it is really to reflect, right, to describe and to say, you know, this is what's really going on. Let us not be part of this tendency to say only this and not this, right? People will use the terms that are meaningful to them. So that's my response to the second question. The third question was harder to answer because I guess it's more broad-based, right? In my fieldwork and community, how was Lumad deployed, right? So my field research has been primarily with Tagabao Bagobo. However, I'm interested in Bagobo, which includes Jangan Klata, right, as well as Obo. I've also visited Mandaya, Blaan, Tuduray, right, Tiboli, right, in various areas, depending on where folks have taken me, right? But to answer this question, I wanted to kind of respond by a bunch of small stories, right? So the very first time I've ever encountered the term Lumad was when I was a college student, and I was listening to Joey Ayala and the Bagong Lumad. I even have their cassette tapes right here, right? So that was the first encounter I've had, right? As a college student and listening to Joey Ayala, because, you know, I'm not from Mindanao. I grew up in Cubao, Quezon City, right? So I am Tagalog, right? With the Kapampangan father. So in that sense, right, when the article that I wrote that uses the term Lumad, dressing the Lumad body, I submitted it to Humanities Diliman, and there was a very interesting exchange I had with the editor, Jojo Buenconsejo, Professor Buenconsejo, right, who was the editor of Humanities Diliman, wherein I put an accent, right, on the first syllable, Lumad. And then he wrote back to me. He says, it doesn't belong the first, it belongs in the second, it's Lumad. And I go, hang on, I thought it was Lumad. And I hear people say Lumad, sabi ni Jojo, no, it's Lumad. So there was this whole back and forth, and we agreed, tanggalin na lang natin yung accent. So I just put Lumad there, right? So here I am listening to everybody. I listened to that, to almost a talk. I listened to my fellow panelists here. And this is a very interesting thing, wherein Tagalog speakers, in my observation, tends to say more Lumad, and then Cebuano speakers tend to say Lumad. Both are fine, but this is something that I do observe. Wolf's Dictionary of 1972 says Lumad. National Museum's book that came out, right, in 2015 says Lumad, right? So I put it out there, and that exists, but that was a very interesting kind of exchange that I had, right? The second story pertains to me in the field somewhere in Caraga, in Mandaya area. I was there with a friend of mine, a guest, who is an expert in Northern Luzon textiles from Ilocos, Norma Respicio. And so we were chatting with the Mandaya weavers who were there with our you know, hosts, right? And at some point, tinanong nila kami, anong tribo nyo? No? So sabi ko, ako taga Manila ako. Sabi nila, Tagala daw ako. Sabi ko, yes, I am Tagala. Then they asked where she's from. She goes, I said, she's from Ilocos. Sabi nila, hindi, Tagala yan. Sabi ko, hindi. I was trying to explain, hindi siya Tagala, Ilocano siya. Sabi nila, hindi, Tagala ka rin. No? So as far as they're concerned, the Ilocano-Tagalog distinction is not relevant. Tagala din siya, pareho kami Taga-Luzon. Is that valid? Yes, it's valid. It works for them. So the Tagala-Ilocano divide, right? It's just like, isa lang yun. No? So am I gonna say mali sila? Hindi, yun ang kanilang perception. Then you just basically note that. And that's a very important thing, no? Which I think something that Gus also pointed out earlier, about usage of self-ascription or ascribing others, right? So this is part of our everyday social reality, and we exercise this, right, by trying to name things, and that should be reflective of our understanding, no? And then, of course, in my own field research, right, it didn't come up, but if I did ask, the few instances I asked about the term lumad, ang sagot sa akin, pwede rin. Taga-Bago ba siya, pero pwede rin Manobo, no? Taga-Bago, pwede rin lumad, no? So depende dun sa konteksto nila, no? Where the indigenous peoples happen to find themselves in. So because of my research that focuses on textile practices, during my field work, 1993 to 1997, bumalik ako ng 2009, 2010, no? Lumad as a term was not helpful. It was not possible to show someone a photograph showing textiles produced by indigenous peoples of Mindanao and have lumad as a meaningful category. Because the term emerged because it was inevitable that there would be a pan-Mindanao consciousness. It has to happen. It is inevitable. So the term, in a sense, requires erasure, right? It cannot encompass individual kind of, right, specific cultural and social identities. But it is a necessary erasure of boundaries because there is an inevitable emergence now of a pan-Mindanao consciousness. Why? Because indigenous peoples always deal with people from the outside. And if they do not have some kind of pan-Mindanao consciousness, aapihin sila, diba? So kailangan talaga magkaisa in some way or the other. And lumad has emerged, right, as this term, right? And it's a term that certainly is quite meaningful. Now, what I find amusing about the whole idea that lumad is a CPP, NPA, and DF term only, which I'm sure they use it too, you know, I mean, why not? As Gus said, you know, what's the big deal, right? Is that it's also used by collectors, right, who collect the textiles that are created by the Mindanao indigenous peoples, right, and pay a lot of money for them, and these are collectors within the Philippines as well as outside, and they call them lumad or lumad, right? And I even got an email recently that said, you know, tell us more about ikat by lumads. English na, plural na, no? Lumads, biglang lumad sila or lumads, no? As well as young people seeking to tap a heritage issue, you know, the term comes up. So I understand that that is a meaningful term, right, in those specific contexts. However, right, in my own research, it was not meaningful, right? But my having to say that does not mean that it cannot be used. No, it can be used, except we need to be aware that it is essentially a political term, right? What I mean by political term is the term that encompasses, right, a supra-local identity, which is necessary, kailangan ng term. Kasi paano mo nga, as Oona was saying, how will you refer to it, right? Now, the funny thing is that as anthropologists, we also have to be aware that when you are in the field, you also hear these terms that we as anthropologists and as academics are often told or trained to say those are bad terms. But in the field, what do I hear? Natibo, diba? There's a problem with native. Natibo, ginagamit. Tribo, ginagamit. Constantly, tribal, right? So you have these terms alongside, right, all the other terms for their specific groups that does exist, right? So I guess my viewpoint then from the field would be that, you know, if we keep in mind our role, right, as anthropologists, as academics, right, that essentially it's a kind of witnessing. No? And so this association of this term to that very narrow meaning, right, is essentially very ahistorical, right? It's actually very poorly informed, and it simply will not work. And so those are my remarks. I would like to stop there and hope to hear from other members who are in the room. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Cherubim, no? Maraming salamat sa tatlo nating discussants. Ngayon, pag-usapan natin yung si Dr. Cherubim ay sinabi sa atin, no, na isang beses lang niya, isang article na sulat yung term na lumad. Si Dr. Oona Paredes sinabi na subtitle ng libro niya, no? And Dr. Gatmaytan said that, you know, this is a political term, this is a collective term, no? And sinabi nga niya sa atin yung political history ng term na ito, no? So, yung tanong dito ay, bakit may NCIP resolution? No? Nasa idiotic man yung term, ridiculous man yung resolution, but we cannot simply say na hindi natin siya bigyan ng importansya siya, no? Dahil ano siya, government resolution. Yung sinasabi din kanina ni Dr. Cherubim na it's a government agency, no? So malaki yung influensya niya sa indigenous people, sa anthropologists, sa UGAT, na kung saan siguro na-red tag ang UGAT dahil sa press conference na nangyari when the resolution was publicly introduced by the chairperson of NCIP, who is also the executive director of the NTF LCAC, no? So the NTF LCAC stands for the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, no? So ang nag-facilitate ng FRESCON to introduce the resolution, the NCIP resolution, is NTF LCAC, no? So bakit may resolution, no? Anong pwede nating gawin dito? Ano yung konteksto ng resolution na ito? Gus?
Honestly, I was taken by surprise by the issuance of the resolution. Like I said in my statement, no? Everyone was going on with their lives, and then suddenly we have this invented crisis where, this word that we've been using for 40 years, more or less, no, is suddenly unacceptable. So I'm not quite clear on the surrounding political context, but my suspicion is that it's linked to this growing slide towards the right, no, where the state is trying to assert its control over, like I said, no, the way people think, and one way of doing that is by controlling how people use language. So it's trying to dictate choices of words, trying to link certain words like Lumad with unacceptable parties or actors such as the CPP, NPA, and NDF. So yeah, well, yes, no. Someone just pointed out in the chat, no. It's basically red tagging. It's NCIP allowing itself to be used in red tagging. So we can see this as an indicator of the fact that even a marginalized group like the indigenous peoples of the Philippines or of Mindanao, no, has become politically integrated with the larger dynamics, no, governing the Philippines. That's maybe Oona or Cherry have other things to share.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Of course, I don't know the real answer because I have no idea what discussions took place. No, pero watching from afar, from here in California, my gut tells me that it's related. Well, of course, the slide to the right, but that's been going on for a while, right? But I think it's just it's might also be related. I could be completely wrong, but it might also be related to the fact that well, the impression that I get from over here from paying attention to Philippine media and social media and other things is that there seems to be an increase, at least in regular media and social media, of IP issues and causes and struggles, but more specifically Lumads, that are being, I think, they're being voiced mostly by organizations and NGOs that are associated with the left, and some of them are actual ND groups. Okay, so there's no nuance there. Some of them are really organized by people in the ND. Okay, so tsaka yung lumalabas sa social media, for example, nung nangyari yung sa USC, that whole issue with the youths and everything, I heard more than one narrative of what was actually going on, and one, but the most prominent narrative that was repeated in mostly in the most repeated in the mainstream media, and duplicated everywhere in social media. The voice that was being I guess the voice that was the only voice really that was being heard very, very prominently was the voice of um, you know the voice of people purporting to speak for the Lumads and the Lumad youths. And these were not IP voices. These were people, and some of them, like I actually did not know that God, what is his name? I can't remember his name right now. Sorry, I'm blanking on it. Co-founder of the NDF was actually affiliated with one of these. Actually the founder of one of these groups. And so when that kind of happened, I suddenly was like, no, I mean, this is absolutely not an IP voice that's being represented. We're just really promoting, I mean, there's no other word to call it but propaganda of one particular, of one particular group. But whether their narrative is actually correct or accurate about the events or not, it doesn't even matter anymore, because once the government sees, pula pala sila, oh, so everybody here is red tagged. So, and I think that's how the government maybe impulsively react, kasi nakikita nila na hindi nagtatagumpay yung kanilang voice. The government is not being I mean, they're kind of losing the plot in other words, and they don't want the
side. Oh.
the left to left, and by just, I mean, it's not a very smart move to try to eliminate this word, because it's a ridiculous move.
Oh, nawala si Dr. Oona. Dr. Quizon?
Hi, thank you. Yes, so hopefully makabalik si Una.
Yeah. Bitin ako.
Bitin din ako. Like Gus, like Una, I don't have the question that you asked, Lilian, is, bakit ngayon? Bakit ganito? Hindi ko rin, nagulat lang ako when I found out I was given well, for one thing, I'm not even on Facebook, so you can imagine how kind of disconnected I am. I had to ask my daughter to download the full statement of the NCIP resolution, because she's on Facebook and I'm not, no. And I find with interesting thing at the very, very end on Facebook, you would have the hashtag hindi sila lumad, hashtag stop IP exploitation. So I guess what I can say is that in agreement with Una and Gus, no, that there is essentially an interest in polarizing, no, which we certainly witness here in the United States, and it's happening elsewhere. And it's an interest in trying to kind of, I guess, grab the issue and run with it. No? So, which is the standard technique of polarizing people, no? Either you're for us or against us. No? So to say that Lumad, to use the term, right? And now, of course, anthropologists, no, yun ang kumbaga narrative arc na gustong mangyari, right? Are all essentially, right? CPP, NPA, NDF, no? Is kind of part of, I guess, the plot line of any polarizing discourse, no? Na parang dun ka or dun ka, hindi pwedeng sa gitna, no? And then if you try to seek for any kind of nuance, no, you will be drowned out. No? Na parang tipong, hindi, no, simple lang yan. Hindi simple. No? Kasi yun, hindi simple. So I guess it's part of that larger kind of thing to take control of the discourse, no? And turn it into this moral narrative. Kaya nga, as Una was pointing out, it's non-IP voices that actually now seek to speak on behalf of the IP, no? So there were a lot of other hashtags during that Facebook virtual press con. And all of them have this kind of, look at me perform my moral outrage against the CPP, NPA, NDF, because I am a good person and you are not. No, so parang it's this kind of framing of a moral outrage, a false premise, because I guess you don't have to be true to pretend to be a moral person. So the irony of it all. But so parang ang feeling ko, that of course has its own echoes, right? When you have elections coming up, right, next year, as well, no. Pero I'd like to kind of focus more on us, no, as all of us here today, I presume, right, are interested in it, right, from the viewpoint of our professional practice, no, what we teach our students, what we read, what we want to learn, and it's very important for us, as anthropologists, to kind of say, we deal with data. We deal with things that are verifiable, no, and we've been doing this for a very, very long time. And also anthropologists as a profession, we are not ourselves, diba? We don't have clean hands either, diba? So, I mean, when you think of anthropology as a profession, when I think of in the United States during the Vietnam War, right? Anthropologists that collaborated with the US government, right? And in order to help in the US government's war, right, in Vietnam, which led to the American Anthropological Association's, ethical statement, no, meant that these types of kinds of encounters lead to a profession that seeks to kind of improve, no, its I guess mandate for itself, its vision of what it seeks to do. So pakiramdam ko, kung may magagawa man tayo as anthropologists, it would be, I guess, to engage with the issue and also to listen. So I read the resolution very closely as well, and Gus, you the wonderful rebuttal of them. But out of all of those, I counted it. There were 9 whereases. Whereas, no, samyang whereas. Whereas number 7, right, was very long. But what I found interesting in there, which I think might be worth thinking about, right, is this kind of element of for me, no, where it said somewhere in the middle of the 7th whereas, no, they said Lumad is similar to or associated with national minorities as opposed to IPs, right? So there's this mention na mali yung national minorities also, dapat IP. So it's very ironic, no? Ngayon IP ang okay, pero so it's like this new way of trying to kind of decide what is acceptable, no? So that was the interesting thing, no? Thereby diluting the identity of IPs and the continued use of Lumad as a misrepresentation and distortion of true identities. So that was there. But what I found most interesting was the very end of that whereas. This is the 7th whereas, no? Where they mentioned that the use of Lumad, or Lumad, no, is a condescending and derogatory term, no? So ang feeling ko, even though I disagree with like the general idea na dapat ganito, there's that element there, no, that is it possible that the use of Lumad, when it's used in a way that's not thoughtful, no, and I don't mean academic, I mean, when everybody starts, people email me and say, write me a chapter on the Lumads, no, and what they always expect would be this narrative of prehistoric peoples, no, who have no history, who live in the mountains, no, and they're performing their authenticity so that us, who are already bereft of Philippine society, can reflect on something authentic and original. So there is also an Orientalism going on, right, for us, no, as members who are not IPs, no. So feeling ko that might be part of what that, right, is coming from. Nevertheless, the connection with the CPP and PANDF, no, as a soul connection, right, is really, I guess, the purpose of it. That's my word. And Una's back. Sorry, Una, you kind of
No,
back.
I thought maybe it was the government interfering with cutting me off. But no, I mean, one thing that I find really objectionable is how only certain groups are, I guess, there's a lot of other organizations, other NGOs, other groups, other actors that are erased in this process, and in this statement, because again, it rather than sort of diminish the importance of shall we just say with shortcut, ND groups, or ND affiliated or ND associated groups. I mean, I think, associated in the sense that the government associates them with the radical left, even if they might not be. There's so many other groups, other community organizations, other actors who are actually doing work with the Lumads, with different Lumad communities, and many of them are IPs themselves from those communities who are doing so many things. And the number of, I mean, in terms of my impression, in terms of the percentage of organizations or actors who are, associated with the ND, whether accurately or not, is really quite small. But this statement gives them sort of this outsized importance, and actually achieves the opposite effect that I think the statement wants to achieve, in that it actually kind of makes them more important than they really are. Because in all the different communities that I know personally about, none of those uh, uh, NGOs or any other actors, outside actors, are actually ND affiliated or even close or even working with or even next to, not even ND adjacent. Whereas but most of the groups are actually formed by the communities themselves, at na-erase sila lahat. Na-erase sila lahat. So it's what's happening with this statement is, it's not only trying to erase the term, but it's also it's also an attempted erasure, I think, whether they realize it or not, of IPs themselves. And that, I think, is one of the most objectionable things, because there's so much going on inside these IP communities, so much community organizing, and it's really interesting stuff, including IP education, IP focused education, that's not being done by Save Our Schools or these other outside groups, but done by
Totoo yun.
IPs themselves. Yung sa Hingoog nga na IP education program, that's designed and run by Higaonons themselves, who've taken the initiative, and they've been doing that for several years na. Walang publicity, walang social media campaign or anything. Wala silang GoFundMe, wala silang Venmo, wala silang PayPal. They're doing it on their own. It's them talaga. Hindi natin naririnig yun. And it's na-erase sila. Sorry, it's the whole thing makes me so angry, and I'm not being words are not coming out correctly anymore. But so I'll stop. But this is na-erase sila, and nakakainis talaga, nakakainis.
Yes,
Siguro
Una,
yun yung
nakakainis
point.
precisely.
Nakakainis.
Yung
But
siguro yung point.
yung erasing, no, yung erasure na ginawa, actually yung justification ng resolution, yun erase so many things. Like the press con was very clear on it, no? Like sinabi nila na na-create daw yung term noong 1987. It was an UGAT conference, no? UGAT. And I'm very happy na yung isang dato ay hawak na hawak pa niya yung kanyang certificate, 1987 UGAT certificate. I'm so happy to know, no, na tinatago nila yung certificate ng UGAT. Sinasabi ngayon ni NCIP Commissioner na hindi ba dato, no, na lahat ng participants sa conference na yon sa San Carlos University of San Carlos sa Talamban campus ay mga party member. So it's really a sweeping statement, no? Lahat sweeping just to erase positionalities at lahat, no? So yeah, inis tayo lahat, but according kay Dr. Quizon, kailangan may gawin tayo.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you actually follow that logic, no, na kahit sinong gumagamit ng term ay CPP, NPA, NDF, then we really end up in really bizarre places, no? Kasi kunyari, I think Rappler pointed out that that Lumad was used in this book produced by the National Museum, no? Which came out in 2015. And in 2012, I believe, there was an exhibition wherein, and it was in the book also, the opening speech was by Senator Lauren Legarda, who has supported, right, a lot of research on Mindanao textiles. So, and CPP, NBF, I mean, what do you say, no? Parang ginamit yun doon. So lahat na sila doon. So all the people that worked on that volume. So it becomes this kind of, right, illogical, no, exercise na parang to say, kung gamitin mo yung term, therefore ganyan. kung anthropologist ka, therefore ganyan, which is I guess precisely what the polarization seeks to achieve, no? To stop us from thinking, to stop us from saying, teka, diba? Teka, mali yun, diba? So yeah, it needs to be pointed out how the wide usage and the fact that, kumbaga, nakawala na, hindi na nila pwedeng ibalik sa loob ng kahon at sabihin na, diba, na ito lang yon, hindi pwede. Kasi nandyan na, ginagamit na ng mga tao in various ways.
I'd just like to add, Duterte himself has this photograph of him holding this paper bill, Stop Lumad Killings. No? So if they're going to condemn anthropologists for being in the 1987 meeting, please condemn also the president.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's nothing. I don't think they're worried about consistency or integrity when it comes to this statement. I don't know how coordinated this really is, and I really am not sure what they think they will achieve or what they hope to achieve. So yeah. So I just hope that hindi matatarget ang mga ang mga IPs who use this term without thinking, because I mean they do use it in the communities that I work in, but only when they talk about indigenous peoples in general, and they say, kami nga mga lumad, or they use it as an adjective, saying that they're the ones who are lumad to here, to this part of Mindanao, as opposed to another part of Mindanao. And it's not really about, I mean, of course, using the term lumad in particular contexts to refer to themselves and other people like them is not a way. I mean, Sherry was talking about sort of erasing the boundaries between the different groups, but for me, I see that the role of this term is really kind of drawing and enforcing a boundary between those who are indigenous to Mindanao and those who are not. So that's the easy way to kind of say, for an IP in Mindanao to say, there's us and them and you're them, which is fine with me, because they need to kind of protect themselves in this way from interlopers and people trying to kind of take advantage of them, which obviously still keeps happening. So this is something that they use in with reference to the outside and not amongst themselves, like to refer to their own group, obviously. I mean, anyway, I mean, I think we're all kind of in agreement about it, and it's just what do we do though? I mean, what can we do?
Yeah. It's 11:26, and I think there are questions from our participants. Elders of UGAT, can you just come in and ask questions before we go to the reaction of Brother Karl, Gaspar? May mga nag-raise ng hands kanina eh. Ito na makita ngayon.
Taas naman kayang chat. So,
I know.
There's so
and
many.
many of our participants are students.
Yeah, it's a good mix.
Graduate school students. Yes, there's a request from Judy Pasimio. Can we request Sir Pons Binagan to
and Sir Opong Rodil is also in the audience.
Yes, our UGAT elders are all here. Sir Pons? Okay. Yes, Sir Pons, there.
Nakamute ka, sir.
Ay, oh.
Sir, hindi ka namin marinig.
Sir Pons.
Sir Pons, yung microphone.
Mic.
Lilian, ikaw na lang mag-unmute sa iya.
Yeah, I guess so. No, okay. Yeah. Sir Pons, you're live.
I think we need another in-person round table.
Pwede na.
Meron akong sagot doon sa kaya lang mahaba eh. How much time do you have? I need 3 hours to explain this.
Wag naman, Sir Pons.
Anyway, yung takeaway ko lang, because I think we need to follow up these discussions. No? unang-una yung point ng right to a name. I think maganda yung presentation ni Gus and tracing it. No? And then yung role ng mga anthropologists as, to use Cherry's term, as witness. Yung term ko naman dun yung, the task is to achieve an ethnographic reel in terms of the work. No? Ano ba yung sinasabi nila doon? No? And then yung sabi ni Una, no? Kung slogan baga, IP voice first. Meaning for anthropologists to take their cue from the IP voice, from the IPs themselves. Kasi kung minsan ma-anticipate natin, misanticipate, pero bang term na gano'n? Yung aspirations o yung situations mismo ng mga IP, baka ma-preempt. And I think that's counterproductive in terms of the exercise of empowerment. No? Pag na-preempt. Kasi ang lagi kong sinasabi sa kanila, pag may nag-imbita sa akin na magsalita tungkol sa IP, hindi ako spokesperson ng mga IP. Kailangan ang magsalita dito, IP. The latest was, I was invited by ANC to talk about IP self-determination. No, my job is done. It's already there. It's a national agenda to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination. I think you should invite people from the communities because they're able to talk. Eh sabi ng ANC, ang mahal-mahal naman magdala ng tao dito. My goodness, what an excuse. Ang yaman-yaman ninyo, pwede kayo magpadala. But anyway, I'll give you some names. So I gave them some names. May naimbita naman. Ang problema, yung nakabase din sa Manila. So, but in any case, after that, yung presentation, tumawag sa akin ng ANC. Sir, naintindihan ko na yung sinabi ninyo na hindi kayo spokesperson ng katutunan. I think we really should listen to the voices of the IPs themselves first. So in that context, ano yung papel ngayon ng mga anthropologists sa ganitong sitwasyon? No? Solidarity with them. In fact, may sinabi nga ako doon sa isang international conference ng UP Manila. The way things look now, globally, with the existential threat of climate change, biodiversity loss, and all that, we are all indigenous to planet Earth. And we can learn from the specific experiences of indigenous peoples in terms of sustainability, ecosystem sustainability, cultural sustainability. In fact, pag tinatanong ko yung mga communities, what are you most proud of? Ano yung talagang, pasundayag, ano ba yan? Ipinagmamalaki. Sa Mindanao, sabi ko, ano yung pinagmamalaki ninyo? We are still around. We have survived and still alive. And we're looking forward. So sa akin, malaking bagay yun, no? If you listen to that kind of voice. At the same time, paano pa mapalakas yung kakayahan? I call this evolving and developing capacity of indigenous peoples to exercise the very rights that they fought for. Kaya sabi ko, baka ang framing ngayon, kung noon, mga anthropologists that were in the advocacy part, research advocacy part, baka ngayon naman, yung full implementation of the rights that have already been gained. And ito yung maganda itong ganitong perspective na yung name kasi, sa tingin ko, no, and this requests, I think, a longer time. Yung tanong kanina, bakit sumulpot ito sa NCIP? I think, I'll give you this background. In May, let me see. Guys, meron kang copy nito, yung state violence.
Yes.
The Philippine Social Science Council held a seminar workshop on state violence, which framed yung discussion, at least in the introduction of the Senate, in terms of the emergence of a counter-insurgency state. So, in terms of this framing, malinaw yung tinatawag ng government na they have an all of government or all of society approach to eliminating the insurgency. So kahit sino dyan madadamay na with the slightest association with the insurgency. Kaya ngayon, hanggang ngayon, yung mga, patingin, yung mga lawyers, judges, etc., they're all implicated now. So if you frame this political turbulence, etc., cultural wars, etc., within this all of government, all of society approach to the counter-insurgency, it's a very big tent, the biggest tent. Lahat tayo kasali na dyan. And I think it's important to unpack this problem in that context. So ano yung magagawa ng Papa in solidarity with all others who have been implicated in this all of government, all of society approach. I think that is a task that anthropologists, given their holistic approach, can provide a more granular approach to this problem of implication by identity, parang guilty by association. Everybody is guilty by association and therefore becomes vulnerable. So, yun sa tingin ko, baka kailan may follow-through na activities pa in terms of concrete steps that anthropologists as professionals, as academics can do. Kasi if you do the work of witnessing as solidarity action, that means that we are all implicated in this. It's not just IPs there in the in the countryside or IPs in Manila, but all of us. So your response should also be all of society. And I think that anthropologists, using a holistic perspective and given their structural position also in society, can help and participate in this as witnesses, as living witnesses. So yun yung aking takeaway dito. Kaya maganda na masundan ito sa tingin ko kung gagawin natin ito na follow-through activities. After listening to the IPs themselves, I think we'll have a better frame to really, what do you call this, lay out the kind of concrete steps. Pabiro ko na sinasabi ng ang anthropology dapat meron siyang so what anthropology or any discipline for that matter. In other words, after all is said and done, what's next? Kasi madali naman yung magsalita ng ganito, ganun, we work in this, we work in that, but what's next? Kung na-unpack na natin yung problema, ano yung concrete steps? And then if you put it within the electoral cycle, sa tingin ko, preparing for the next election and then afterwards, ano ba tayo? Are we just responding to the electoral cycle, to the dynamics of the electoral cycle? Or are we responding to enduring structural problems? So yun lang muna yung aking preliminary thoughts. Baka mawala yung oras si Karl. Pwede na?
Maraming salamat, Sir Pons. Narinig ka
wala
na.
naman akong, teka muna.
Okay.
Wala akong pindot pero bumalik yung unmuted. So ano ba yan? Am I in?
Okay. Maraming salamat, Sir Pons.
Okay na.
Sa information ng lahat, si Sir Pons Ponciano Binagin ay ang founding president ng Ugnayang Pangagham-Tao, yung Anthropological Association of the Philippines. May karapatan siyang magsabi sa mga UGAT members, ito yung trabaho niyo pagkatapos nitong mga roundtable discussions. Maraming salamat, Sir Pons.
Lilian, ikaw na lang mag-mute sa kanya. Okay. I-mute ni mo. Okay. Yeah.
Yan, na-mute na siya.
Wala niya na-mute.
So, si Brother Karl Gaspar, isang redemptorist at isang guro ng anthropology sa Ateneo de Davao, ay magbibigay ng reaction sa kung ano pa mang major points na nakita niya dito sa unang roundtable discussion natin. Brother Karl, good morning.
Good morning, Lilian. Thank you very much. Maayong buntag sa tanan. Magandang umaga sa lahat. I'm so privileged to be in this forum. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And it's great to have a reunion with Oona and Cherry and many others. There are names I don't know, so glad to meet all of you. And here is my take as a synthesis to the sharing so far. It's been a very interesting morning, and I think we covered a lot of ground. But I think there are 6 questions that I would like to serve as guide in the synthesis. And the questions are, 1, what arose that led to the crisis in relationship to the use of the word Lumad? Secondly, in fact, what was the historical narrative that would help explain to us how the word was coined, which the NCIP people seem to not know, which belie their ignorance regarding even checking on available literature and published documents related to this. Third is, what is in fact a process that leads to people ascribing names to themselves, or what accounts for the fact that certain words arise that would then refer to them, and after a while it helps to identify them as people, and very clearly it becomes a marker for their identity. Fourth is, apart from the historical perspective, there's also the structural perspective, as Cherry pointed out, in relationship to the rest of the state apparatus. What in fact have we seen are movements within the agencies and institutions connected to the state apparatus that would give us an inkling regarding how this phenomenon arose, this issue of the crisis of the word lumad. And then the fifth question, and I'm glad that Pons Binagin had an intervention, because it's from his point that I would deepen further the answer to the question, what is really behind this? What is the root cause? Is it just banning the word, or why ban this word? Is it connected to something bigger than what would immediately seem to be? And then lastly, what are the implications of the recent events on anthropology in the Philippines, and how will this impact our practice as anthropologists, especially within the frame of the vision mission of UGAT through the years? Okay, so I'll try to attempt as short as I can to the 6 questions considering our limited time. We all know that this crisis arose when on March 2 of this year, the NCIP, I believe in an in-bank sort of meeting, came up with a resolution that would denounce the word or the use of the word lumad. And this because of their belief that this has been coined by the CPP, NPA, NDF, and therefore it has done disservice to all the lumad, and therefore by banning the use of the word lumad, then you take away that particular issue from the scene, no, of indigenous peoples. So this particular crisis seems to have been invented as feedback from the ground has indicated. Ordinary people among our indigenous peoples would say, nganong karon pa man lang ni sa kadugay na nga gigamit kining pulunga o karon pa hinuon na himong problema. Why all of a sudden we are faced with this? Because I'm sure, like many of you out there, we were all taken by surprise. In fact, the first time I heard of this resolution was just a few days after March 2 through our network with the Ateneo de Davao, and I haven't seen it in any of the social media or mass media report. And I thought they were joking, it was fake news, but it turned out it was true. And therefore, it has created all of these recent developments, including our attempt to try to respond to this particular issue. Now, a question related to that now is, because the word has been banned, and unless there is a strong reaction to denounce it from our side and other people who cannot tolerate a state deciding for us in terms of the usage of certain names. One question that appeared in the chat box was this: if we are now going to use the word lumad ourselves, will we be arrested? In other words, will it be illegal then to write articles or to give talks and then you refer to the word lumad, because it's been already denounced as a red tag term, and therefore its usage would be illegal? The second point, so what's the historical perspective? Now, of course, the NCIP, based on whatever little sources or limited sources that they have, including this Lumad leader, supposedly from Davao, who was a main source of their information, that either it came out of an assembly of Lumad leaders that purportedly was very much linked to the NDF movement, CPP-NPA, and therefore it was an institution that was technically organized in the name of the revolutionary movement. And so they pinned down even a particular date and the name of this Lumad organization, which in the article of Karl Argilias in Binda News pointed out was incorrect based on the data provided by Jimid Mansayangan. Or, interestingly, they are also trying to tie it up to UGAT in terms of how it also used the term. And apart from that, there hasn't been any other source of information that I know that would pin it down to specific groups or specific persons that could create legal problems insofar as these groups are concerned, because then they are red tagged. And we know what's happening today with groups of people and institutions that are into this list. Owing to the Red Scare that seems to be a major element of the state administration these days. But as Gatmaytan expressed in his presentation and is documented by many literature, the term Lumad arose out of the Mindanao Sulu Church. Now, I can speak for myself. I'm perhaps siguro one of the oldest in this loop now. And in my early 20s, I was already very much connected to this church in Mindanao, because after I did my graduate studies in Manila, I worked immediately with the Marinol missionaries in the Davao region, up in Davao del Norte, Davao Oriental. And there were Mandaya there. And I can already begin to reflect that even at that time, we were not using any more words like cultural minorities and so on, because most of the time anyway we were speaking in Cebuano, because the church in Mindanao at the time was very much Cebuano dominated, and many of our meetings and assemblies and seminars, materials that were published, plays that were mounted were already all in Cebuano, because everyone, including the Lumad, could speak and understand Cebuano. So it became like the lingua franca in many of our meetings. And through the years that I was working with Mindanao Sulu Pastoral Conference Secretariat, that led to the founding of the first network of indigenous peoples in Mindanao, that led to the organization of this ecumenical group called the Mindanao Sulu Conference for Justice and Development. All of these institutions that were church-based, both Catholic and Protestant, became like the occasions when Lumad people and church people were coming together because of the situation of the brutalities and atrocities that they were already faced at the time, especially during martial law, because of all that Panamin was doing in these particular IP territories. And that's why when I did a paper, when I was studying in UP under Professor Cobar, I thought it would be good to write this history, and I called it the Lumad Social Movement. And that's a document that's readily available, and it's already out there, and it's been reprinted by our journal in the Ateneo. So there is literature that will give you an idea of the historical perspective, and that corrects some of these historical revisions that this term was coined by the CPP-NDF in terms of the organizing that was happening only in the 1980s, even mid-80s, when in fact by the mid-70s, the term was already being used and no one questioned it, because as I said, Cebuano, Bisaya was like the language when we gathered together. And people were not using any more words like Nitibo and cultural community and even tribal Filipino, because we were beginning to think that they had pejorative meanings. And anyway, since it was better to speak in the local language, so Lumad became a very natural word. So that's really the historical perspective of how this word arose. And therefore, to claim that it was coined by the CPP-NDF in PN, therefore it has an ideological color, is just so off the historical narrative. And that's why I wrote a reaction piece that Mindanews included in the article of Karl Argilias. Natawa talaga ako. I really laughed. And I said, nabuang naman yung mga taga-NCIP. Kadali raman nung mangita og materials there because it's readily available, but they would rather rely on sources that are really not that are really equivalent to fake information. Third, how does the process of ascription come in or arise? Well, our speakers already have explained that, no, that in culture, in history of humanity, naming ourselves, naming things, naming articles, and so on, is a right of peoples. It's the peoples that will eventually coin certain terms that would refer to themselves in terms of their names or to things around them and so on. And it's not up to a chieftain or an emperor or a king or later on a republic that would determine what usage to what words should be included in the usage of the everyday conversation, because they have already arisen, and therefore it follows then that when they do write their literature, they would use the very terms already being used. And it is only when the terms became politicized for whatever are the reasons of the institutions that have a stake in the meaning of these words, when there becomes a problem, because then it is then the state that takes into itself the power to name people, to name things, and so on. And that's really tantamount, as already been said by our speakers, to controlling our mind through the control of language, through dictating what words to use. And that really has, as Gus said, Orwellian dystopian reality, because that could lead to even more tragic actions on the part of those in power. The fourth is, in fact, there are agencies in government that do not make this a problem, and in fact are using the term Lumad. And even I know that the NCCA and of course the National Museum and even local government units and so on have been using Lumad or referring to this in terms of their documents and exhibits and so on and so forth. Now, we know specifically the National Museum has a publication known as Lumad Mindanao, because there's an exhibit in the National Museum that's entitled Lumad Mindanao. I know that for a fact because Ana Labrador, the curator, asked some of us in Mindanao to help set up that exhibit. So the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. What kind of state apparatus do we have where there seems to be a lack of synchronization regarding where these agencies should be in regard to these things matters? Now, it brings us to the very important question, but why is this happening? What is really behind this? If we dig deeper beyond just the controversy of the use of the term, what is really behind it? And one has to take into consideration the whole landscape. And I think Pons Minagin spoke about a very particular element that will be very important in this discussion, which is the all of society approach to try to deal with the insurgency problem. The 50-year insurgency in the Philippines has persisted all these years. We all know that. And it's possibly one of the longest surviving communist rebellion across the world. And the government, the state, still has no evidence to show that they are winning in this war, despite all the money, all the resources that have been set aside to try to win this war. And what is the reality, specifically in Mindanao? And that's why Lumad is a term that arose out of Mindanao, and this issue is really very Mindanao-based for the moment, although, as Pons said, it has national implications. If you look at some of the reality of the geographic characteristic of Mindanao, we have many areas that are mountainous. And through history, since the colonization period and so on, many indigenous communities have retreated to the uplands, to the mountain regions, wherever there still are areas that they can penetrate. Although we know already that this has become very, very limited until today, and even then because of logging and so on, there are less and less forest already. But they're there. But we also know for a fact that the insurgency is a guerrilla war, and as is the characteristic of a guerrilla war, they need forests, they need places where they can hide. And this is common knowledge that in many upland territories, there are still guerrilla zones, and in some of these areas, they're quite vibrant. And they're there along with indigenous communities. Not that all indigenous communities are supportive of them, certainly not. But the fact is that there are IP communities, IP leaders who, because they're pushed to the wall or coming out of a Bagani tradition through the years, have had close collaboration, in fact, direct involvement in the revolutionary movement. Lately, I've heard this in various fora, meetings, conferences from military, from NCIP people, but never from those that I would consider very left-leaning, that 70 to 80% of the foot soldiers of the NPA are children of Lumad households. This has been a refrain that they have been using, which I thought, since I heard them say this, because I really doubt, are there concrete statistical evidence to really prove that this is true? But they've been saying that openly, publicly, because I think they are already expressing the need to try to diffuse whatever support the IP communities have for the insurgency movement in the uplands, where they still are taking place. Now, if you view this in terms of other developments, say in the last 3-4 years, then it makes sense, because it is also here where you locate the closure of the Lumad schools. The Lumad schools, in the network of Lumad schools that are seen as being influenced by the ND orientation, have been subjected to all kinds of harassment, and many have been forced to close because of the harassment, the arrest, and even killings of teachers and their leaders. And that's why today in Mindanao, there has been a depletion of the Lumad schools. And this is where, again, the erasing thing of Oona comes in, because I was just talking 2 days ago to a group of missionaries in Davao del Sur, and they really have no connection at all. They have avoided any connection at all with the left or any red tag groups. But they are also being suspected now, and they are being approached by the military, and they can sense that they are being pulled together, lumped together in this red tagging that's taking place. So if you include all the harassment of the Lumad schools, and of course Cebu, what happened with San Carlos is but the tail end of this movement that has been taking place for years already, then it makes sense that all of this is an attempt to try to really find a way so that there is less support that the IPs will have for the insurgency, because of the assumption of the military that there is an increasing support of the IPs for the insurgency movement. But as we know, this is all very much part of what Pons calls the all of society approach, because as we're sitting down here in the past few days, we know what have been happening within government agencies in terms of making lists of judges and lawyers and teachers, beyond of course, the legal, what they say are the legal fronts of the anti movement of the Karapatan and the Bayan Muna and the labor sector and so on, that this is being lumped together in such kind of a big sweep that one could sense that the impact of the anti-terror law has been already reached in this level where we could expect more killings, more arrests, more harassment, and so on and so forth. Which brings us lastly to the whole question of what then of anthropology. Yes, indeed, anthropology as a social science performs the role of being able to witness to people's struggles, people's aspiration for full humanity, and so on and so forth, as well as to witness whatever are developments in IP communities that which can lead to a betterment of their life and a better future for the children. And therefore, it's very important that we are also very reflexive regarding where we're coming from and what are our own intentions when we do express our solidarity with indigenous peoples. It's been expressed, and I think no one will disagree with what has already been said, that let the IP people themselves speak for themselves. There was a time when those of us who are of the privileged sectors, of the middle class, of the intellectual class, and so on, tended to be the voice of the voiceless, whether they're peasants or fisher folk or battered women and so on. But that time is gone. The oppressed are the ones now who should be speaking, who should be voicing whatever their concerns are. And we are there to provide whatever backup support, but let their voices be heard. We cannot be their voice. And that is why this whole issue can really only be resolved if ultimately the Lumad leaders themselves will have to decide in regard to how ultimately, collectively, in a non-politicized manner, they would rather ascribe themselves. If Lumad really is not the right term to refer to them. But in fact, this issue already arose here in Mindanao when Paring Bert was still here among us. And there was some kind of a discussion we had regarding this because some people were saying there are objections to the use of the word Lumad. So in fact, we said, yeah, it's about time we consult a group of Lumad leaders. And we did try to bring together as many Lumad leaders who can then discuss with us and then let us know whether they are comfortable with the term Lumad. And there is a proceeding of that meeting that will prove that in the end they said, yeah, for the moment, within the fluidity of the use of this word, this is us. This is our identity, our collective name, and we continue to use it. So there was already, in fact, some attempt to try to bring the Lumad leaders themselves to decide whether this name really is something they feel at home with. But maybe this coming Saturday, in the second part of this forum, we can hear a lot more and in the years to come. Lastly, how is Philippine anthropology implicated, especially as in UGAT? And that's what Pons was suggesting. Our role is still very much in the field of solidarity. UGAT, its birth, its vision was very much connected to this whole notion of solidarity that goes way back, its origin in relationship to land rights, to basic human rights, and all the other rights that indigenous people should be able to enjoy. But given our analysis of the all of society approach of the state apparatus to end the insurgency, but which will claim so many victims, including very innocent ones, in this process of erasing everyone and lumping you together as enemy of the state, then there is there is a future we need to face with the same vigor and the same commitment that we've had through the years. And as Pons said, we need additional discussion and fora to continue this kind of a discussion, because my own sense, and I think I have an experience in this particular field when the Red Scare became really intense in the mid-80s. leading towards EDSA, and many of us got victimized by that. That it, as the saying goes, history can repeat itself. That's all. Daghang salamat, may buntag sa tanan.
Maraming salamat, Brother Karl. And personally, maraming salamat no, for reminding me that not to be angry at this situation, but to examine the root causes, to examine what can we do no, as anthropologists in this volatile, this created situation. No? Before we end no, the first roundtable discussion, can we ask our three discussants briefly no, to say something, only to guide and to connect us to the second roundtable discussion this coming Saturday?
Uh, um, if I may, I'd like to start. I support this call for dialogues uh, between us as members of a discipline and with the indigenous peoples and also with the NCIP. I think it's time that I don't know. It seems to be necessary to open up dialogue, not just with the IPs regarding the use of blame, but with NCIP itself to at least clarify what is it they are trying to achieve uh, with this resolution. No? So uh, if UGAT comes up with further plans or other plans for dialogues, no, I hope we can address these two groups, no, these two stakeholders. That's all I can add for now.
I guess we're going in the same order, yeah. When I first heard about the resolution, my initial thought was, oh no, I have to change everything that I'm doing. And because I thought at first that there might possibly be a widespread sentiment, or maybe even not widespread, but at least that there was a significant sentiment that this term Lumad was offensive somehow and really objectionable to actual IPs, because I thought that that would be the reason why they made it into a resolution, right? But the more I talk to the people I know and other people that I really trust on this issue, I on IPs themselves, I realized that I was completely wrong, and this is about something else. So there's a couple of things I want to say. The first is that we shouldn't fool ourselves, because even if we stop using the term Lumad, we can still be red tagged. The point is not whether one word is allowed or not allowed. The point is to shut down any potential for dissent and nonconformity. So while the ND types are now the target, maybe we need to be reminded that in previous decades, even church affiliated people were also red tagged. In fact, anyone who had anything to do with just helping, even in the most apolitical way, marginalized sectors of society were targeted and red tagged, and so, the term, using the term or not using the term is not going to protect anyone. Um, so, but the other thing I wanted to say was, where do we go from here? And that was Sir Ponce's question, as well as Brother Carl's. Well, um, here in the States, usong-uso ang collaborative research, right? And that's something that I've also been trying to do in my area. So collaborative research, meaning using, the community, people in the community you work with as co-investigators in your project, people who will help, who will you basically design the research together, figure out the research questions together, and eventually, ultimately, also have them as co-authors in your publications. And this is what I'm aiming for in my current project. Um, and so this is something that I think I know the Wennergren Institute for Anthropological Research in the States is really encouraging this approach. And it's not really to do, I mean, some people might think that has to do with sort of being inclusive and being sort of some kind of being allies and being sort of activists and all that, all these sort of nice kind of ideas. But to me, the value of doing collaborative research and the importance of it is not that really, although that's kind of, it can make you feel good about yourself, fine. But for me, the real value of it is that it actually just results in much better research, because you're not like sort of this other person coming in and kind of viewing people like they're on a microscope. This is really, I think this might be really the best kind of anthropology possible, best kind of ethnography, because from my own personal experience, I would not have come up with the questions that I did for this research project without actually this collaborative approach. And so what I'm doing now is actually what the community told me they were interested in, then that I should study. And they think I'm studying it, but we're actually all doing it together. They still don't understand that we're all kind of equals in this, but they think I'm still kind of doing the project and they're working for me, but it's really not. And so, but yeah, so this is what I would say is the future is collaborative research, true collaboration, not just sort of getting them to do what you want, but true collaboration where they are co-investigators. So thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. Thanks.
Okay, alphabetical, so I'm the third. So I agree with Gus that the discussions of dialogue are important. I would like to add that if it's possible, I don't even know if it's possible, that it should be framed perhaps more broadly as not just NCIP, but government organizations, no, GOs. Dahil ibang-iba ang mundo pag galing ka sa NCCA, which is the group that I mostly work with, no, because of the nature of my research. And I imagine, no, also with National Museum, and I'm sure there are other agencies that have worked closely with IPs, including the ENR. So it may be framed more broadly as a GO thing. And I don't know what UGAT's role would be on that, although I imagine UGAT would be a really great kind of partner, no, in such a dialogue, because then it makes it clearer, no, that ano ba talaga, no, as far as the state, no, and UGAT as a non-state, right, witness, no, interlocutor, I guess, no. So that's one thing. I listened to Oona and I agree with her now. Kung ireretag ka, ireretag ka. Parang, so there's a certain inevitability with that kind of reality, no, because we know that those types of approaches are not really fact-based, no. Pero I guess it's true also now our response would have to be kind of not within the atmosphere of fear, no, but it will have to be in the atmosphere of our profession, no? What we do as anthropologists. And so shameless plug lang, ano, pero Maria Mangajas and I have this special issue for Agham Tao that we call it's a practice-based assessment, right, of the IPRA law as far as anthropologists are concerned. And so I'm going to put the website. It came out of a conference that we did, primarily because Maria and I, Mangas and I, who for those of you that I'm sure you all know Maria, no, Maria and I came to this understanding that both she and I completed our most important forms of fieldwork before IPRA. No, so we were like pre-IPRA. We did our field work before there was IPRA, whereas people like Oona, right, and many others, right, have been working right post IPRA. So it's a very, very important thing that for us is also a project of discovery. More for me because I am right based overseas as opposed to Maria, who's teaching and is very much in there. No, so I believe that more broadly, although we would love for you to kind of contribute to that special issue, but we're approaching it as a case-based, right, praxis-based assessment, and not to point fingers, mali kayo, tama yon, palpak sila, but it's really like, what did anthropologists actually do since the law came into place, right, that actually was impacted, right, by the law. I think with those types of really specific case-based, right, research that we publish, so we have something to talk about, no, and clearly, right, then certain important insights can happen, right, moving forward, right, from there, no? And this is my last note, no, it's parang from my experience, because I work with textiles and material culture. I work with, unpack bagobo, no, unpakan bagobo, right? I always work with things, no, and I work with things that tend to be embedded in different kinds of frameworks. Much of it is this tendency to kind of freeze IPs in space and time. I think that it's also important for us to keep in mind that there is not a single voice among IPs, no? That within groups, when we bring up the discussion of tradition, it's a debate that they're having, that the young people are having in relation to the old people, no? That they're actually disagreeing amongst themselves. And I think it's so important that when we think about this, that we don't think about this in this notion of one tribe, one voice. No, it doesn't work that way. And it's important na yung mga voices na hindi karamitan naririnig, no, nandoon. So kung makikinig ka sa mga babae, makikinig ka rin sa mga lalaki, sa matatanda, pati sa bata, no, sa mga edukado, sa hindi na edukado. It is not a single discourse. And it's because, right, the reality of living as an Indigenous person is a very big challenge, no? So maraming hindi nakaka-capture kapag gagawin nating isang voice lang. Wag nating i-assume yun. So yun lang siguro. And salamat for inviting me. This has been really a wonderful experience for me to listen to everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. On behalf of the board members of Ugnayang Pangaghamtao, I say thank you to our three discussants, Dr. Gas, Dr. Cherubim, Dr. Oona, and our reactor, Brother Karl. Gaspar, thank you so much. And to advertise our second roundtable discussion this coming Saturday, March 27, it will start at 10 o'clock in the morning. And the title of this second roundtable discussion is Kinsa ang mga lumad? Views from Indigenous leaders. We will be joined in this second roundtable discussion this coming Saturday. We will be joined by Indigenous peoples leaders. So far, we have 3 confirmations coming from Mr. Edtami Mansayagan, an Arumanin Manobo, Timuay Santing Santos Unsad at Tiduray, and Dato Makapukaw or Adolino Saway at Talaandig from Bukidnon. So we will be joined by many, but so far 3 have confirmed participation, and we invite again participants. We have 380 earlier. We invite you again to join us in the second roundtable discussion. Maraming salamat. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.
Salamat.
Nice to see all of you. I wish we could
you
do
very
it in
much.
person.
Okay.
Hi, Brother
Nice
Karl.
from here.
Hi,
Thank you,
Gas.
everyone.
Hi,
Hey.
Cherry. Hi,
Karl.
Lilian.
Ngayon pa